Thank you for sticking around. This is usually one of the most exciting parts because you get to hear everybody together and kind of listen to this thing. Usually we start off with questions for our interdisciplinary panel, but some of them have to leave a little bit earlier, so we were thinking that we would open it up at the very beginning and we can add on questions if we need to. But if anyone has a question now, especially someone who's an undergrad, the floor will be open, and I'm sure our speakers, our wonderful speakers from today, will be able to. So, if anyone has a question, we can take that now. Or we can start. Yeah.
I have a question about memory. Can you imagine any condition where you recover memories that appear to have been lost, if there was some residue of that zeta at those sites?
Okay, so
could you take that as well? And then if you could repeat the question before that would be
I don't study short-term memory. I'm not. So the question was, I think, if I can remember, was about basically, is there savings, is there residual of the memory after erasure? Is that part of the question?
Can you imagine recovering a memory that appears to have been lost? Just so you can make a memory stronger.
Right.
Is there a threshold below which a memory appears to be gone that you can imagine recovering it?
Okay, so that gets into the whole issue about retrieval of a memory. Is amnesia due to a retrieval of a memory or a deficit in retrieval versus a deficit in storage? And this issue has been going on in psychology for decades. And it's basically unsolvable because if you can't get at it, if you're talking about an animal or even a person, if they can't retrieve it, you don't know if it's a storage problem or not, other than you can give like a reminder and get some evidence that it's there. So the way that I would approach it is to try to understand what is the molecular biology of the storage mechanism, because that's what we're after. And then the retrieval is how that reads out in that specific population of neurons that are encoding the memory. So all I can say is, so far, for the vast majority of tasks in which the erasure has been done by inhibiting PKM zeta, there's no evidence for savings. That is to say, you give a little reminder, and it doesn't seem to make any difference. Memory just seems gone. Now, I must say that we're always testing where we think from decades of other people's work where the memory is stored. So we do conditioned taste aversion in the taste cortex. We do spatial memories in the hippocampus. We do fear memories in basolateral amygdala. So we're always making educated guesses about where that storage is. But basically we're trying to figure out the tools for answering that question.
So my memory just follows up on that. So I was wondering about the specificity of the memory loss that we're going to observe with the rat in the rotating platform. So that rat had its learning, avoidance learning erased. But I was thinking, well, does that rat then remember where the feeding dish is?
We think, okay.
How do you make it specific?
Okay, so the first question is it specific to one memory? I think not, because it's basically like reformatting your hard disk and having all the ones converted into zero. So you've got a perfectly functioning new hard disk, but everything is zero. All the information, no matter how old the memory is been wiped out. So I don't think there's any specificity in these compounds that inhibit PKM zeta. All memories. In fact, we've done conditioned taste aversion with multiple memories, and they all get wiped out. So how do you? But then now that's, as I say, useful. That's useful for chronic neuropathic pain if you're erasing memories in the spinal cord. who cares about, you know, the other memories in the spinal cord? There probably aren't too many memories in the spinal cord. You can, and like I said, you can always relearn them. So to make it clinically relevant for post-traumatic stress disorder or for addiction, you have to come up with a way to erase specific memories. And that's a whole other body of research called reconsolidation blockade. Because remember I said there's consolidation for the first hour after you learn something? Well, in some situations when you retrieve an old memory, even one that's days to weeks old, it now becomes sensitive again to many of the same blockers of consolidation. And so that way, only the retrieved memory is being affected. And what we think is going on is in the process of retrieval, there's a breakdown of the pre-existing PKM zeta, and then it gets resynthesized. So if you could block that new synthesis of PKM zeta without affecting the very stable PKM zeta that's already around, you'll have a way to erase a specific memory.
Does that mean that all memory, when you retrieve memory, it's all destructive and it's continually destroying and then reestablishing itself?
That's the current thinking, that many memories, can't say all, but memories are very dynamic in the sense of during recall they basically get, you know, redone. But to be redone, you have to degrade the old one and remake it. So we think we have a handle on how that's happening at the molecular level.
You were talking about having, is memory distributed in the sense that you have redundancy and then you can localize parts of it and then have a worsened signal-to-noise ratio but still have to be retrievable?
Memory, you know, depends on the memory. Some memories are very distributed. So, for example, in fear conditioning, over weeks, the aspects of the memory that are associated with fear that are visual are in the visual association cortex, and those involved in the sensory the somatosensory are in secondary somatosensory cortex. So yes, they're distributed throughout the neocortex. So what will be interesting is if you erase one aspect of so you're all linked together, right, in a network. So what's interesting is that it may be that if you erase part of the network, the whole network seems to collapse. And so that's turning out to be pretty interesting.
So this is a question for the panel. How do you see the theories discussed today being implemented now and in the near future in terms of ways of learning, specifically massive online computer courses and other
Yes. What? Can you say the middle three words again? Yeah. Am I going to do this one?
Sounds like it.
You want me to make up an answer? What? I just didn't. I missed kind of the. I'm going to give you the answer, but I just need to hear the question again.
Oh, I was just asking in terms of what the current theories you discussed today, how they're being implemented in today's modes of learning in the future, and particularly in relationship to online learning and other things that are sort of becoming much of a...
I didn't propose theories today. Does anyone else want to?
We talked about on a theoretical level different aspects of learning, right? So we covered science, a lot of different studies. So how can these be applied to education, and in particular, new education that's happening with new technology? So for instance, online classes and things like that. Get that captured.
Well, one thing that I think is an issue is that the kind of exploratory learning that I was talking about that children are doing, like exploring counterfactuals or considering things that aren't actually the things that you know, but thinking about other possibilities. I think there's a danger with online learning that is going to be less easy to do than other kinds of learning, than more directed kinds of learning are. Peter Norvig, who's the person who's responsible for the famous class at Stanford, is a friend of mine. And I said to him, well, look, how do you tell whether any of these, whatever it is, 15,000 students have had an idea that you never could have anticipated or an answer that you never could have anticipated? And there really isn't any way, which is what I have as my criterion for an A in my classes, right? There isn't really, there may be a way of doing it, but it's a lot harder to do that, to encourage that kind of learning. Now, it may be that what you could do is provide children, say, with a space that they could explore. It's just a space in cyberspace instead of being a space in real space. So you could imagine, for instance, setting up an evolutionary simulation where instead of just finding out a bunch of things about evolution, children could be exploring what actually happens when you speed up evolution or slow it down, or could actually see what interventions they were making to bring it about. That could be a kind of way of doing that. But my impression is that the typical online courses are not doing that.
I would just say, too, generally, since most everyone here is students, I think the more that we think of learning as something that someone's teaching us, the more we kind of limit our learning. So it's like if you go to class and that's where you learn, or now you go online and you don't even interact with people personally, and that's where you learn. And then what are you doing the rest of the day? Like, you're learning, but you don't qualify it that way, and so you don't treat it the same way. And I think that's, well, you're going to learn anyway, but I think that's a little bit dangerous, just to make it edgy, I guess, to think of learning as like something you do, that's something you're taught versus just something you're always doing. Yep.
Well, the only comment I'll make is that, I had two great teachers in my life, one in high school and one who taught me about protein kinase C at Columbia. And, I had a deep emotional connections with these people. So, we really cared about each other for years. So that's all I have to say.
Actually, and one more thing. The nice thing about online classes and the impersonality of it is it makes it easier to cheat, right? Because you can Google everything and probably find it. And I think that's actually really beneficial, not in a, learn how to learn academically, but just learn how to explore. I think that's something that would be useful in some sense. You have to cheat in life anyway. Only you don't call it cheating, right? Did you want to?
Oh, well, since I have the microphone. Yeah, so one thing that comes to mind in particular is, we explored taking Watson into the medical space. I got an opportunity to work for a while with the team at Cleveland Clinic, and they're very provocative in their medical education. One of the things that they're really interested in is, explicitly recognizing that having teachers stand up there and lecture you stuff you can just look up in books or look up online and learn on your own is not as productive as it can be. And what may make more sense is teaching people thinking frameworks and how to use these tools, and acknowledging the fact that memorization of all this material is just not going to cut it anymore. And that, in fact, they have to learn how to use these tools and learn how to interact with computers and learn how to be more effective in finding stuff and being more directed in how they direct their minds, from memorization to learning frameworks and learning how to thinking, learning how to finding and exploiting the tools that they have around them. And in fact, one of the places they're going is there's now a project between Cleveland Clinic and IBM to use Watson as a tool to help in diagnostics and to help in treatment evaluations. And that tool is being used to really take on a lot of the burden of doing the enormous search that you would have to do otherwise, and to build confidence in your diagnosis and build confidence in your treatment evaluations, and to cover a lot more breadth than any one person was able to do in the same amount of time before. So I think they're teaching differently, teaching with an awareness of what the tools can do today and what they will do in the future.
So, what kind of programming language do you use to create Watson, and how many people are involved in the project?
So Watson, we started off with about 12, and over a 4-year period we grew to almost 40 doing 35 and 40. So on average, it was around 20, 25 researchers that worked on the project. All the new code we wrote was mostly in Java, but there was some C code, there was some Prolog code, so there are lots of little different programming languages here and there, but for the most part, it was written in Java with some big chunks in C.
Yes. During your talk, when you were talking about the way that Watson was kind of testing out different algorithms, I was thinking a lot about semantic priming experiments that were done, in the last couple of decades. I'm wondering if there's anything that you think that the way that Watson figures out the meaning of words, it will speak somehow, and this is actually a more general question, if you guys, the panel has ideas, that will speak to hypotheses about how we understand the meanings of words. For example, how priming one word will prime different semantic content vis-a-vis different meanings of that word.
Well, I mean, I think, it was clear fairly early on that, to really kind of nail down the meaning of a word, as I suggested in the talk, you really had to understand the context in which it was used. And it's sort of triangulating that context that helps you start to disambiguate what the word really, what the word really intends. And sort of an interesting thing, one of the questions was whether, liquid was something about, this fluid surrounds the, the nucleus in a cell, whatever it was. And the answer was, as I mentioned, the answer was cytoplasm. And so one of the things you kind of had to figure out was if you had a candidate answer, was it a fluid or not? And you might find some, or was it a liquid actually? And so you might find some evidence that cytoplasm was in fact, a fluid. And they said, well, is a fluid a liquid? So you'd go and you try to look this up in some taxonomy. So WordNet is a taxonomy that's under development for years at Princeton. And if you ask it, is fluid a type of liquid, it would say, don't know that to be true. Because it's a formal taxonomy, and a fluid is a more general concept than a liquid is a type of fluid. But if you were able to extract how words were actually used by people, using them as opposed to people formally kind of documenting their intended meaning, you find out that fluid and liquid are used by people mostly interchangeably. And if you extract that information out from normal language usage, you get some evidence that fluid's a liquid, liquid's a fluid, no one really cares. And in this context, I'm going to be able to create that kind of quote unquote equality, and you end up getting the question right. So that speaks to the point that you could try to nail down these semantics, but in the end, meaning is most strongly related to usage, and in usage you get all this context. So what's most likely to sink? And if the context is oceans, it's vessels. If the context is the game of pool, it's maybe the 8-ball, right? So again, that context helps you define, and helps you predict what, that language model, what's most likely to come next. And it's not about the language, it's about what's like, in my examples, what's likely to come next in that shared experience. And then that gets mapped to words.
Does the convergence of frequencies and oscillations over multiple brain regions in reference to Ekstrom's talk reveal something about consciousness and free will? And is there a relationship to the uncertainty principle?
I guess I'll take that one because it involved my talk.
Answers.
Hopefully I'm paraphrasing a question correctly here. So your question is, does spectral fingerprinting, in other words, the simultaneous presence of different frequencies within the same networks in the brain, does that relate in any way to consciousness? Frankly, I don't know the answer, so I'll just leave it at that. There's been a lot of work to suggest that frequency multiplexing in different frequencies may be important for consciousness. I'm not a philosopher. Anyone else wants to take that one on, feel free. I like to stick within my area of expertise, and it's narrow enough that I think I'm safe on this question. With the other one, that was even broader, so I'll just pass the mic if that's okay. Feel free, anyone who wants to take on the big C or little c question.
Just like, you can do a broad version of that. I mean, multiplexing, and I'm going to pretend like I know this much of what you even talked about, but like in terms of oscillatory dynamics, I mean, pretend I'm like the 5th grade version of him, right? Just because it's kind of embarrassing to talk about your field. But I'll say in my understanding of any sort of oscillatory dynamics, I mean, you've got, like very fast signals can only propagate so far, so they're relying on these harmonics in part just to keep things in sync over long and short distances. And I've seen some literature here where, I mean, depending on, just in your experience, when you're asleep in a different conscious state, you're oscillating at a different frequency, right? I mean, that's not necessarily multiplexing, but kind of the way I understand the harmonic stuff is, I'm like so debating even saying this. No, it's never mind. I can let go of that. But like the harmonic stuff, I mean, when I think about oscillatory dynamics or rhythms, I guess, in the brain, I just think the way I kind of maybe naively think about it is just that part of that is just a limitation of what's physically possible. It's like your tweeters can exert a lot of force, but they're not as powerful. They can't pass through a wall like a subwoofer. So these low frequencies have a lot of power. And they all have to be oscillating together at different frequencies just so they can create, local processing for filtering small bits of information, but also synchronize that over long distances. And where I've seen this in the literature in terms of transitioning into consciousness or some sort of experience, I guess, people will look at like beta oscillations. So just certain types of frequencies that correlate with a person's ability to bind features into a perceived object. So by bind, I mean your brain looks at something and it filters out all the different features, and then at some point it puts it back together into, red chair. And that, the ability to, or maybe how well you can have that experience seems to correlate maybe with how well your brain is oscillating at these certain frequencies. I don't know, I mean, I don't know if anyone has ever answered like even if your brain is oscillating at perfect frequencies every single time you're having an experience, that translation into consciousness, like, what do you think? It's pretty, I don't know, it's pretty interesting. Anyone else want to?
Well, I'm the philosopher, but I like the first speaker's answer. I think that despite a huge amount of work going into studying consciousness, both from philosophy angle and psychology, I don't think we know very much about it at this point. Binding can occur unconsciously, so I think we're in very, very early days in understanding anything about the relationship between consciousness and the brain.
Well, just in addition to that, that's certainly true. We don't know how it's going to come out, but my bet would be that what will happen is it's going to turn out to be the wrong question, which often happens in science. So an analogy that Patricia Churchland uses, for instance, is what happened to that question about life, right? So there was a long time when it seemed as if there was this tremendously urgent question about could you possibly ever get life from non-living things? And how could you ever get life from non-living things? And it turned out, so what's the answer to that? Well, there isn't. It's not like there's an answer about it. There's a whole bunch of different answers depending on which properties of life you're talking about and how they're related. Sometimes it's about complexity. Sometimes it's about replicability. There are lots of intermediate cases. And my guess is that the same thing is going to turn out to be true about consciousness. And that isn't just speaking as a philosopher, but also particularly as a developmentalist. One of the good things about doing developmental psychology is that it makes you realize that things that all seem to cluster together for adults often fall apart when you're thinking about children. So for adults, the kind of classic, I'm the philosopher, I'm sitting in my study, I'm looking into my mind, and I'm trying to think about consciousness, there's many, many, many things going on in my mind at that when I do that. And with children, you can see that some of those things seem to be there in children, some of them aren't there in children, and my guess is that our theory of consciousness is going to have, and lots of people have said this, things like awareness and is going to come out differently from self-reflection, which is going to come out differently from memory, which is going to come out differently from visual experience, which is going to come out differently from attention. There isn't going to be a single story about this big C thing that is consciousness that is somehow related to one thing about how the brain or the mind function.
So before the Jeopardy game, we asked Watson what it was thinking of. And its first answer was double jeopardy. I shit you not. And its second answer was Dave, which was pretty frightening for me. And its third answer was its grandmother.
And you talk about conjunctive versus disjunctive categories in the sense of like determining colors versus determining like language for kinship, in the sense that you have your black and white category, then your red category, then your yellow-green category, but contrast that to like kinship, where you want to say this is my maternal grandmother, like that would be the idea of an efficient, successful language.
Did I talk about that?
Yeah. No way.
Oh, my short-term memory is going.
Okay, all right. Well, that's fine. Can you just elaborate on that a little more? Why adults like do that?
Yeah. So the point here is that
It's okay.
part of the reason for doing these experiments in the first place was that we have a lot of these kind of overarching principles about the way we organize information that's almost independent of the details of how, in different domains, it's almost independent of the details of what the information actually is. And actually, that's a beautiful example, where if you think about color and kinship, even if I don't know exactly what, I say I'm an anthropologist, I don't know exactly what kinship system someone has. Maybe they talk about maternal aunts with the same language. But I know what the general structure of it is going to be. I know it's going to have something to do with who was born to who, and I know it's going to tend to have a tree structure. And the same way with color, I know it's going to be a continuum that's chopped up in various ways. And the question is, that we were asking is, how do children, and there's some evidence that often children seem to learn those general principles before they actually learn the details. So, for instance, my Augie, who's my beautiful grandson, has the idea of color words, but he doesn't know what they are yet. So, if you ask him what color is that, he'll say green, orange, green, or you ask him to count those, and he'll say 1, 4, 16, 22. So often what seems to happen is they kind of get the idea that, counting is kind of like this before they actually have the details. And what we were interested in trying to see is if we gave children information like this is, what we were really doing was just using the Blickett detectors to say, this is a kinship-y kind of thing, and this is a color-y kind of thing, and then see if the children would actually learn it. And it kind of makes sense that the children are better at learning those higher order arching principles than they can actually sometimes learn those before they actually learn the details.
Hi, Dr. Dominic. You discussed the difference between exploratory and exploitative strategies, and how you think of Ken Robinson's thesis that schools kill creativity.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you had any feelings about that. I mean, there are trade-offs to either strategy, and if so, what kind of educational paradigm? He seems to think that education can benefit from a paradigm that fosters exploration.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you agree with him. And then the second part of that question would be at a approximate level, what might that look like with respect to synaptic pruning? Less synaptic pruning, or a different kind, as the brain then can be organized through adulthood. So I just was wondering.
No, I think that's actually a really good question, and it's actually a hard question because doing the transformation from the explore to the exploit mode is actually important. So I study 3- and 4-year-olds, and I think that, being in that 3- and 4-year-old state is completely fantastic, but I wouldn't want to actually be in that state myself all the time. Occasionally, with the help of love or neurotransmitting changing chemicals or something like that. But you wouldn't want to be there, you wouldn't want to be there when you were trying to get through a faculty meeting. So one thing that I think is this is a hypothesis, but one hypothesis might be that the transition that we actually see to schooling, which doesn't just happen in schooling, it happens in lots of cultures at around 5, where kids go from basically living a life in which someone's taking care of them and they're playing to a life in which they're learning how to actually do things. It's kind of the transition from primarily being in that explore mode to being in an exploit mode, where you're actually learning how to prune, for example, where you're actually developing skills. And the trouble is that in our school's educational system, we don't do either of those. So it's not that you're exploring and playing and finding possibilities, but it's also not that you're becoming an apprentice and learning to have honed very accurate skills in the way that you do. What you basically are doing is learning how to go to school. Completely what you're doing is learning how to go to school. So in my kind of ideal system, you'd have the period for up to 5 or 6, which would be just a very rich environment with lots of people who love you and lots of stuff to play with, and then a period where you actually started to develop skills that you could accomplish and hone when you were in the later period, and that would be sort of the ideal. But there's some really interesting, tricky questions about this. So, for instance, it's clear that we've extended that period of helpless exploration longer and longer and longer. I mean, that's kind of what all of us are doing. That's what graduate school and undergraduate school is like. And that has the advantage of providing more potential for learning and flexibility, but it also has the disadvantage of not having expertise and skill. And I actually think that there's actually some evidence that some of the tsuris of adolescence, particularly of adolescence now, reflects the fact that there's a kind of genuine, this may be what the great philosopher Isaiah Berlin talked about, life's basic tragedies, which are things where there just isn't any solution, problems where there's really two fundamental aspects of human nature that are at odds with each other and there isn't any way of finessing it. And I think that explore and exploit may be kind of like that. There may not be any one way, either for individuals or for societies, to figure out a way to solve that in an ideal way. But I think it's pretty clear that our educational system doesn't even go any way towards solving it at all.
Do these, to add on to that, do these different strategies that's reminiscent of in Watson, when you talked about there were many different strategies and through machine learning you kind of converge on a single strategy on which to use for each question. Does that seem familiar, and would you be able to maybe with artificial intelligence that adapts over time to acquire some sort of knowledge base, at first using different strategies primarily and then later different ones?
Well, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, again, I mean, these aren't, I mean, the learning strategy in Watson was pretty basic. I mean, I don't know that there's a good analogy to what we were just talking about, but at the same time, there was when it was solving a problem, there was very much this sort of exploration phase where I would say, you know what, I really have to look at this in a very rough, loose, way where I don't deeply understand what's going on yet, and until I actually pull up some specific evidence, will I be able to kind of do the more granular determinations. So it would generate a bunch of hypotheses. So based on the few things that were said in the question, it would generate a bunch of hypotheses, which was a very interesting, technique. It wasn't like I'm going to deeply understand exactly what this question is asking, sort of almost out of context. Instead, I'm going to do this general exploration, come up with maybe 100 possible answers. Vast majority of them are wrong. Some of them are really the same answer but expressed different ways. And for each one of those, on an independent thread, I'm going to go out and assume it's right. So each thread now goes off independently and in parallel and assumes that answer is right. And then it goes and collects evidence. And then that's where these 100 different algorithms come in, and they look at this evidence and they try to understand does this evidence really support or refute that answer. And that's where there was this huge diversity of methods. But it's sort of interesting why there was this huge diversity of methods. For one, there was no one knew, none of us knew how to write the perfect understanding algorithm that deeply, perfectly and deeply interpreted that language, mapped it to some sort of model, and navigated and reasoned over that model and came up with the answer. Rather, you look at really simple things, like very shallow methods that might just look at syntactic congruity, between the question and the answer. It might look at some semantics, but maybe the semantics that make a whole lot of sense, but you do some semantic matching. Might look for the use of negation, the use of modalities in those sentences. When all these features were combined and trained, it was able to kind of zero in on the right answer. And in some sense, that looked well, it doesn't really understand what's going on. And I think, in some sense, that's very true. But on the other hand, and you could go see Ken Jennings' talk, one of the things he says is that, at first I thought this computer did things completely differently. And then I heard Ferrucci talk more and more, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is kind of the way I answer the questions too. In other words, because in that split second that the human mind has to build confidence, it's not doing a deep reasoning of what's going on. It's really doing many different, shallow interpretations and triangulating and saying, oh, I just have a lot of confidence in the answer because of all these different shallow things that pointed to that, to that answer. Of course, though, the human can build a deep and enriched model for that stuff as well and do deeper reasoning. And I think that's presently harder for a computer to do that over a broad domain of knowledge. We can program the computer to do that kind of deep reasoning over a specific model, but it takes us human manual effort to build that formal axiomatic model and then for it to do that reasoning. If we want to do that reasoning over huge swaths of knowledge, that becomes much harder to do. But it's amazing how many of these shallow methods can help triangulate on the answer and produce an interesting confidence in the answer.
How do these go on the Torrance test of creative thinking?
Say that again?
Sorry to take away your question.
This is one panel member asking the other panel member a question. Go ahead.
But it was supposed to be quiet. I was curious how Watson does on the Torrance test of creative thinking. Basically, like a part of which has a divergence.
Probably terribly, right? Because again, Watson was really programmed essentially to take these natural language questions and get specific answers to them. I think Watson becomes interesting when you take the superficial kind of question and answer out veneer away. I mean, Jeopardy, had this model, question and answer out. You couldn't even talk to Alex Stroh. I mean, 80% of the time, Watson would have loved to say, but Alex, what exactly did you mean by that? Did you mean this or did you mean... But, you can't do that on Jeopardy because, it wants to disambiguate. It wants to try to triangulate and knows where it's not sure, so it sort of wants, more cues. I think, so when you take that veneer away, that game veneer of question and answer out, really what it's doing is it's kind of finding a path through what it's read and saying, if you can go from these words and these phrases and, in the question to this concept through these passages I read. And then if you can go from this concept to this one through these passages I read, what it's doing is it's finding a path to the literature that supports an answer. And it's doing that without anybody having written in it a single if-then rule. And that's what's exciting about it. Because it can start to find explanations for answers, find paths through the existing literature for answers without building a knowledge base and without writing a single, axiom, but rather using the knowledge that's there. The trade-off is it doesn't deeply understand that, but the good part is it's still finding an explanation that makes sense to a human. And so a human could read that and say, oh, I see, I understand why that answer might be right. Because it produced justifications from human-written literature, from human-written explanations. Sorry, I went on too long.
I think we have time for one more question, especially one that concerns the entire panel.
I was wondering what you envision in the future of learning and memory and what you think we should be working towards. So should we be making meds that make humans remember better, or computer-human collaborations, or renovating the education system?
Yes, that's seriously. So my research is more on multisensory stuff on synesthesia, and I can tell you that some of the most interesting research on synesthesia is what happens if you get a room full of people who don't experience this kind of conscious sensory blending, and it turns out that high notes are smaller and brighter, round things taste sweeter, more crass instruments like trombones taste more sour. There's a lot of ways in which we're learning and processing information that are kind of not that we're not consciously aware of or not using all the time, but that's very, very integrated. So basically, the more different channels you can stick in there, the better. And then just be wary of kind of how you're learning and, use those.
I personally think our big focus should be on solving neural disease. I think we should be trying to cure diseases like Alzheimer's, stroke, epilepsy, diseases which we still don't have a cure for. We have a lot of great insight into the molecular mechanisms that might be underlying some of these disorders. So I would say we need more funding for research to solve these things and fund research like what Dr. Sachter's doing.
Thanks.
Not that you're lacking money right now.
Well, from my point of view, I'm a neurologist. And the thing is, neurology, there's a big tendency to be a therapeutic nihilist, meaning we've been around for a long, long time and made a lot of progress in understanding diseases, say neurodegenerations. But in fact, what's the only really good treatment for a neurodegenerative disease? Well, that's L-DOPA for Cinemet. In Cinemet, that's been around since, early 70s. It's really the only good treatment for a neurodegenerative disease. And so these are really hard problems. One, you're only going to figure them out if you keep on doing research and trying to figure it out. But the way that my view of how medical breakthroughs are made is by understanding the fundamental mechanisms of biology, and then unexpected low-lying fruit comes down and you pick those fruit. And so, for example, I work on memory, and I had no inkling of insight into chronic neuropathic pain. But if you figure out, I think, as I said, I think that's where the clinical application first will be for understanding the fundamental mechanisms of memory storage, will be on something that most people don't think about as being a memory, but same mechanism. So my view is you go forward to try to be as fundamental as possible and use your intuitions to be as deep as possible in your questions, and then the low-lying fruit gets picked. And that's how I think diseases get cured.
I think we should build a computer that wins all game shows. That was a joke.
It's about reality.
Of course we should cure diseases. So I look trivial here, but there actually is something important that I think the kind of work we did on Watson should lead to, which is helping to accelerate research. I'm sort of a big believer in this. If we can just make knowledge more accessible, more facile, people can just get the information they needed quicker. And I'm not just talking about trivia. I'm talking about scientific information, medical information. Can we get machines to help accelerate the research process? To tie the big data mining over large data with the inductive theory development, so that you can get answers and explain them and get information you need. I think there's a big opportunity there. I'm not exactly sure how to do it. I have some ideas. Not going to tell you about them, but yeah.
I'm done. You're done. Good. We're done.
Great. Well, I'd like to specifically thank all of our speakers today. We have a group here, as well as the people who had to leave earlier, for doing a phenomenal job throughout. And enlightening our minds on various subjects and a large range of them. So thank you. I'd also like to thank the Synesthesia Association of Berkeley, Brain Bites, and the Brain, Mind, and Consciousness Society of UC Santa Cruz for presenting today, all the poster presenters, and finally all of you for coming here and organizing this conference worthwhile. This is the 5th annual conference, so we're very happy to have you here since it's such a milestone in our history. We hope you've enjoyed the day. And I believe we have just give back this for our speakers. But otherwise, this is the end of the conference. So thank you so much for coming. Thanks for coming.